Thank you very much. So today we'll talk, as the lecture seemed to suggest, as the title of the lecture seemed to suggest, we'll talk about globalization and like its regional and urbanization aspects of it. So next slide. What do we usually associate with globalization? We probably all know what globalization is. It's basically the continuous interlinking of the world throughout information, which we talked a lot about during the previous lecture, and of course through the global trade as well. But you also know that that globalization has a lot of negative aspects. They are not so about 10, 15 years ago, it used to be like major. It used to be a major topic of the news. It was at the time when a lot of young people are protesting organizations like IMF or the International Monetary Fund or World Bank. That's not happening so much anymore. And we'll talk about reasons why it's not happening so much, but the problems still kind of persist. So, the negative aspects which we know they are associated with globalization is, the first topic, is the globalization, basically results in poverty and inequality. I'm going to address this problem, this effect, in the first few slides, which I'm going to go through. So we'll talk about it a little bit more. Also, globalization results in harsh working conditions for workers and developing countries. That's another point you might remember when we had the lecture on migration, which was still in the school, that we talked about how workers are treated in Bangladesh or in Abu Dhabi, and obviously that has kind of a lot of negative aspects associated with it, but also positive aspects, mostly because people who are migrating for work and then they are not doing so well, they still do it on free will, and it usually results in a much better pay than what would they have gotten otherwise. We'll talk about it a little bit more in this lecture as well. Then another topic, on another criticism which is associated with globalization, is that it equals destroying of unique cultures. Well, that's a big topic which is not economic, and we're not going to really dive into it. I just want you to know that even economists kind of consider it as a problem, but you might kind of easily also put there a counter argument that a lot of cultures basically manage to spread out of their original locations because globalization, because people suddenly knew about it. And the last and big topic, that's the reason why most of the protests about 15 years ago happened. International globalization create unfair pressure on developing countries. Well, that is definitely true, and not always the best results. Even though most of this criticism was basically connected to IMF, International Monetary Fund, which is an organization which lends to countries which get in the financial trouble, and these funds, these loans, they usually come with a lot of conditions, and these conditions, they're not always the most suitable for the countries. So sometimes these policies, they basically caused more trouble than they actually solved. At the same time, the IMF especially kind of it changes policies really dramatically during the last 15 years. So most of the criticism is not really applicable anymore. And while they still support prudence in spending and other policies, for example, the forced liberalization of the economies to which IMF lends to, is not really a policy which is being pushed so much as it used to. Basically in the 80s and 90s, when Reaganism and Thatcherism was raging throughout the world, basically these institutions lent to only developing countries which forcefully liberalize their economies. That's not seen as the most suitable policy anymore. So IMF kind of transformed this way of thinking, and nowadays the lending is much more reasonable than that, and maybe also because of that we don't see so many protests against IMF as we used to. So globalization. These are criticisms which are absolutely legitimate. At the same time, again, as economists, we like to look at the globalization as a positive force in the world. And now I'm going to basically put in front of you a few positive things which are extremely important. And I would want you to kind of see how they are changing the world. So the first topic which we're going to talk about is so-called a great convergence, which is a direct result of globalization. You might have heard about it about something which is called a great divergence. I don't know. Did you ever hear about great divergence?
I personally never heard of this term.
All right. So basically, great divergence. And like you can kind of I can show you on this chart. This chart kind of like shows a few selected countries: United Kingdom, United States, France, Japan, India, and China. Also, I also have here Democratic Republic of Congo, and it shows basically the population, which is the size of the circle, and this axis over here basically shows the GDP per capita in the PPP levels, the purchase power parity. So basically, you can immediately see that United Kingdom around year 2010 was much richer, or United States was much richer than China and India. Obviously, we all know it. The problem with this thing is that it didn't used to be that way. We talked about it last lecture. But also, after the Industrial Revolution, the countries which industrialized as soon as that means most of the Western Europe and United States basically escaped the rest of the world, which this effect, which basically is from like somewhere over here, is just after the Industrial Revolution, when the inventions of Industrial Revolutions kind of kicked in and started changing economy. Basically, what we nowadays know as rich countries basically escaped the rest of the world. You could see that the differences over here in 1820 weren't so big, but they were definitely really big in 1960s. And so this whole escaping of the rich countries to the developing countries basically became known as great divergence. Divergence because there were increasing differences between countries of the world, how rich they were. And then globalization changed absolutely everything about it, because suddenly the poor countries, the countries which are with low incomes, they basically first of all, they became industrialized as well as the technology finally diffused throughout the world, but also they could start exporting to the rich countries, and basically become part of the global economy. And that's the thing which starts somewhere over here in 1970s, when China, India, and many other countries basically started growing much faster than the already developed world. And so this part where the countries like China, India are growing much faster than Western Europe and United States, became known as Great Convergence. Why is it important? Well, it is important because suddenly, we are increasingly living in a world which is, where the differences between countries and how rich the countries are and how rich the people living in these countries are, the differences are, decreasing. You could see that the difference, in 1916 between China and United States was amazingly large. It's not so much anymore. Basically China, of course, is a major success. There can be a lot of criticisms to their morals, of course, but economically it's an enormous success, with how many people they basically managed to lift out of poverty, and the fact that China grows roughly 6% every year for many years, and it used to grow even faster. India grows about 77% now, even though their growth trajectory is a little bit more wobbly than the Chinese one. And most of the developing countries, throughout last 20, 30, 40 years are growing faster than the developed world. That's something which didn't exist in last century. Basically, before that, the rich countries were escaping the poor countries. Now the poor countries are catching up with the rich countries. So that is what the Great Convergence is. This thing has a lot to do with how we measure inequality. To do next slide, I hope you all see it. It basically shows just the Gini index all around the world. And you also know, we might have already mentioned in one of the lectures, how do you measure Gini index? What does it say? It's a measure of inequality, how big differences there are between incomes of various groups of people in that given country. So the lower it is, it means that people have like more similar incomes. If the Gini index is really big, that means that there is a few rich people who are basically making most of the income in the country, and there is a lot of poor people. Just before I get kind of to what the next lecture is about, quickly overview of the world. You might have known that Europe is generally kind of equal place. Czech Republic is one of the places with a really low Gini index traditionally, basically almost on par with Scandinavia, which is even more equal. But Germany, Scandinavia, Czech Republic are generally places which have a really low income inequality. And I think we mentioned it during the lecture about migration. Why is it important? Because inequality also really strongly correlates with crime rates. So the more equal country you have, the safer it is usually, which I don't have the correlation here to show you, but you can kind of like easily see it that Czech Republic, it's not really a coincidence that we have such a low violent crime rates, while for example in South America or South Africa the rates, the murder rates, for example, are really high. What is happening in the world? Well, in Europe, it's like stagnates mostly. The inequality is going slightly up, but mostly stagnates. There's a lot of growth in inequality in the United States. There's a lot of growth of inequality in basically everywhere around the world, with like small exceptions of South America, where the inequality is actually decreasing throughout last 15-20 years, but from a very, very high levels. So you can see that still on this chart shows that the inequality in South America is extremely high, and that's obviously not the best way to be for a country to be in, because, well, that's another important point which I wanted to mention. Why is social and income inequality actually damaging? Well, again, it depends on what kind of economists you are. Like mostly the right-wing economists will tell you that income inequality is actually not a problem, because high inequality usually means low taxation, and you want that because you don't want to penalize the successful companies from growing. You don't want to penalize the successful people from working hard and to be paid for it. At the same time, high income inequality is also damaging for economic growth, mostly because it kind of like splinters the market into segments, and suddenly the companies can't just supply goods to majority of people, because there's just basically splits into small markets. And usually what happens also is that the poor people kind of gets excluded from the market and basically have no purchase power, and suddenly the market, which always operates at the scale, just doesn't supply anything to the poor people, and they are basically excluded from the situation, from everything. Also, social inequality has a lot of damaging factors connected to it, because what you want in the economy to have is a meritocracy. That means, if you work hard, if you get a good education, you work hard, you'll be rewarded by, basically climbing the income ladder. But what research found is that like in countries where social inequality is really high, it just like stops working. Basically, if you work hard, it doesn't really mean anything. Basically you are born poor, you stay poor, mostly because your future success increasing nowadays in today's economy is determined by your level of education. And if you don't have parents who pay for your education, then like you'll basically be stuck in a menial job for the rest of your life, no matter what, no matter how smart or talented you are. And that's, of course, it's a waste. You want people to be rewarded. You want the talented people to work in positions which they can actually realize their talents. If you have an economy which doesn't allow it, obviously it's economically damaging. So that's why most of the research actually shows that inequality, either too high or too poor, is actually damaging to the GDP growth. That's a from political point of view, it's a perfectly centrist stance, but it actually works. You basically don't want to have an inequality too low, because that means that you're basically overtaxing and over redistributing money, but you don't want it to be too high, because then it brings all the other negative things as well. So you want to have an inequality which is just right, if it makes sense. Anyway, in the last 15, 20 years, we've seen all around the world, if you look at the Gini indexes all around the countries, inside of the countries, we've seen that the inequality is increasing. But what is actually important to see here as well is that at the same time, the differences between individual countries are decreasing because of the globalization, because of the great convergence. So if you look at the the income distribution of the whole world, you might see that the differences are actually decreasing as well. So if you basically calculate a Gini index not for individual country, if you calculate it for the whole world, it basically shows you that the Gini index, the Gini index of the whole world is going down. This chart, which I hope you see now, it's a chart which is called an elephant chart because of its like elephant-like shape. And it's a really cool chart because it was created by Branko Milanovic, which is originally Serbian but nowadays American economist who works for Harvard University. And it shows what happened to the income distribution of the whole world between 1988 and 2008. You might kind of understand it was a huge undertaking to actually collect all of this data, basically taking income distributions of every country in the world and kind of calculate the average. And so basically this axis over here shows how much the income increased, and these are the groups of the global population divided into percentiles. So basically, 0th percentile or 1st percentile is the poorest people in the world, and then you basically go on, and 100th percentile is the richest people in the world. So between 1988 and 2008, you can see that basically majority of the poor people all around the world basically got a huge increase. Basically, their income grew something between 50 and 80% in only 20 years. Then here around the 80th percentile and the 80th percentile, there was actually a decrease of income, and then the 100th percentile basically did extremely well as well. So who are these people? These people. So these are basically the normal people, or basically everybody who lived in developing countries got a huge boost of income. This 80th percentile people, who are they? Well, they are mostly the poor people in rich countries. So when I say there is a huge benefit for the developing countries to kind of be part of globalization, it doesn't mean that globalization has only winners. people who are uneducated and live in rich countries are basically the losers of the situation. Well, because suddenly they have to compete with all of the companies from all around the world, which have much lower labor costs, and this competition kind of pushes down the wages of basically anybody who work with their hands and live in a rich country. Obviously, for these people, you can kind of say, okay, like, it's not really like they are not losers because they're still living in rich countries, right? Like, so they have all like access to like all the services which the economy provides and the high standard living and everything. But in the last, let's say, 30 years, because this thing actually continues, the development still continues, they didn't really see any increase in income. And then, of course, the very rich and very rich people in rich countries, well, they benefited kind of a lot because, well, they are the people who own stocks. They own equity, they own shares in the like multinational companies, and obviously they did like extremely well. Any questions to this? I hope you're still with me.
Yes, but no questions.
Perfect. Yeah, I just wanted to make sure because I didn't hear you for a while. So just kind of like two extensions of the same point of like, what is happening in the world. This chart basically shows the same thing, just split in 5-year periods of like, how the how the distribution of incomes kind of changed as well. And you could see that, like, basically to yeah, like this first period, like, we could already see kind of like a increase in the developing countries and a huge decrease at the same time in the rich countries, but on the poor part of it. But like, you can see that this shape kind of like still, as you progress throughout time, still moves a little bit to the left. And the fastest growing parts of the world are kind of changing as well. And it basically shows you, like, this chart, which again shows exactly the same thing. It basically shows you not the change of the income distribution, but the income distribution itself. Again, you have basically, how much income, and the like money per month made. And you can basically see, for these groups, so again, poor people are over here, rich people are over here. Of course, there's more poor people in the world than the rich people. And as you progress throughout time, you can see that this distribution is kind of like normalizing. Instead of like one big bump for poor countries, there's a lot of people in poor countries, and then there's like a other bump was the people in rich countries. This distribution over time is moving to the left, and like, its shape is kind of evening out, as you would expect. So like for income distribution. And basically, again, because poor countries are growing faster than the rich countries, we basically see that the differences in between people in between different countries are decreasing, because this distribution kind of becomes a little bit straighter than it used to be, and a little bit less skewed to the left, which basically, if you look at the income distribution and if you see a huge skew to the left, it basically means that there is a lot of poverty. So this distribution, because it's evening out, it means, that the global inequality is decreasing. That's a really important point, and it's a direct result of globalization. Sorry. This is just an interesting chart which doesn't have really to do with anything. It just shows the GDP density of the world, and basically shows you how much it's a density of the product measured. And of course, the GDP, you measure it always in a currency. So basically, it means how much stuff of how much value it's created where, and basically like just shows you the major, like, sources of production of where people make stuff. So of course, United States, Europe, and Asia. That means mostly China, Korea, and Japan. are, the three major three major poles, you may call it, three major centers of the world where like majority of the economic activity is happening. The other important aspects of globalizations, why would we consider it a good thing? There's a clear-cut correlation between how much people and countries trade with each other and how many wars there is. On average, it should and 10% increase of foreign direct investment reduces the risk of net conflict by 3%. That's like a long-term history. And there's some historical data here which basically shows you, how many people are dying in conflicts. Mostly people are kind of always under impression that we live in the worst times we could have right now for right now the times are not really so happy, but it's really important to kind of understand that what we actually have right now is one of the it's actually the most peaceful period of time we have ever been in. So the point over here, before there were organized countries, people died in battles, basically like violent conflicts. It was about 500 people out of 100,000 people, who died in conflicts. In 19th century, it was 70. In 20th century, it went down, and in the whole of 20th century, and there was two major wars happening. It was 60, and now basically for the whole world, basically 3/10 of a person, for per 100,000 people die in conflicts. People just basically don't realize how violent the human history actually is. There's a chart here which you should see now. Basically shows you how many people died throughout history. It's only from 1940s, but you can basically see like continuously decreasing. And of course, there's still a few wars happening in the world right now. Syria, we have Syria right now. We have there was a just ended, I hope, I think I remember it correctly, the civil war in Sudan, South Sudan. But historically, having two conflicts in the world is unthinkably small percentage, basically. And again, you might say, okay, this doesn't have really anything to do with globalization. Well, I beg to differ, it does. Because again, the more people trade with each other, the more people talk to each other, the less of a chance of a conflict there is. They also we can kind of look at the last 5-10 years and kind of think something slightly different. But even the nationalism is actually kind of under check right now, even though the American and British and other countries' policies kind of suggest something slightly different. Globalization was also, because of all of that, a growth in income, especially in poor countries. We see some other things, happening mostly, the absolute poverty, which, if I remember correctly, absolute poverty is still defined as an income under $2 a day. But basically, the World Trade Organization and World Health Organization, they had goals to kind of decrease the global absolute poverty, but it actually went down much faster than anybody expected. And that's not because of some NGOs which would basically just distribute stuff around Africa and other poor countries and other poor parts of the world, but it's mostly because of globalization, because many people in poor countries just become slightly more affluent because of the contributions of the global trade. So the global poverty rate went down really substantially. And like, it's not only like, on the incomes you can see it, we can also see it on mortality, on the expected life expectancy, which is increasing in these countries much faster. And there's few statistics over here, like, that, for example, like the child mortality and infant mortality went down really a lot, yeah, and like 9 million children born in 2005, were able to celebrate their first birthday. 9 million of children more were able to celebrate children than would have happened if there was a global mortality rates unchanged since 1916s, which they of course weren't. Basically, because of that, more people who are born in poor countries survive. They can basically live much fuller lives, and it's of course like extremely positive development, which should like, and globalization should be given credit for it. And all of that, like the rich countries, which the low income countries, which are basically getting like richer by a day. It basically like point out that, like, looking at inequality in the GDP, in that Gini index kind of a scheme of, when you just look at individual at each country, it basically doesn't make sense. You always have to have a whole look on the whole globe and the whole planet Earth, and basically see what's happening in the whole country. And so some researchers, they basically went on and they established something which they call a global middle class, which has a kind of a wide definition. It's basically anybody who has income between $10 and $100 per month, which doesn't seem to be like much, but still, like, the global poverty like is under $2 and sorry a day. So like, yeah, like, of course, like, all of that, when we look at the charts before of the income distribution, and as I said, like, basically it was the contribution of India and China, because and not only of them, like, and many other countries as well, but these two are like often mentioned well, because it's 2.5 billion of people living in these two countries. But of course, like, we talk about Indonesia, we talk about Philippines, we talk about Pakistan, we talk about Bangladesh. All of these countries, they basically like became much more affluent than they used to be. So so Asia accounts for less than 1/4 of today's middle class. By 2020, this share will double, or like, it already doubled. This lecture is 2 years old, so the statistics need here a little bit of an update. So basically, this is a chart which basically just shows the the global middle class. Of course, with like the globalization kind of like doing quite a lot of things, quite a lot of positive things in the world, but of course, like, globalized economy, a globalized society looks very different from what what it used to. And well, how different? The biggest difference is that a lot of people basically just have to live in the cities much more than they used to. So we now can see a lot of urbanization happening all around the world, which basically means people are moving in the cities. Depending on where you're from, if you are in China, from China, like, the extent of what's happening in the world. If you are from Europe, probably not so much, because here the times are a little bit static. Nothing really much is happening here. Like, if you live in Prague, you don't really see so much of urbanization, well, because Prague is still 1.5 million of people, and didn't really change as much, throughout last 20 years. But if you live in Africa, if you live in Asia, you can see a huge increase in urbanization, and mostly because economies which are connected, and they basically create a lot of jobs, and these jobs disproportionately happen in cities. And because of that, the cities need to grow. Actually, I wanted to show you one thing before we go on, and what it will take me a moment before it downloads. So in the meantime, you can tell me if you have any questions or if you have anything to tell me. All right, so now I just have to make sure that you actually see it. So now you should see just me. Yeah, I'm sorry, like I'm again struggling to share that one document. All right, it will probably not work. I basically showed you, like, wanted to show you something which is called an atlas of urban expansion, which shows, you know, like how various countries have grown over periods of time. But that will not work, unfortunately. What can I do? All right, Microsoft Teams don't support the PDF. Oh, that's disappointing. Anyway, so again, like, you know, I would want to talk about a few negative aspects of you know, like supposed negative aspects of urbanization around the world. Can you just quickly? I just shared the presentation again with you. Can you see it?
Yep.
Perfect. So first of all, let's talk about China, which is an extremely interesting case. Do we have anybody from China here today?
Yep, I'm from China.
Oh, perfect. Yeah. So you can correct me at any given time. Like, you know, I'll try to be, you know, it's going to be mostly positive, so we don't have to be afraid. But you know, so like what you see in this picture, you know, it's called so-called handshake buildings. I don't know if you ever handshake buildings. I don't know if you like know about it or like heard about this phenomenon. It's I can imagine it's not really so publicly known in China, but like, you know, we as urban economists, we kind of like, you know, find it interesting. You know, you might kind of guess why they are called handshake buildings. You know, you can kind of see that the you know, the little paths between the houses are really small. And the reason why they are small is that they are not according to any construction code. And the reason why they are not according to any construction code is that it's because they are illegal. You know, they are not built legally. You know, basically what you see here in front, like on this picture, is an example of a Chinese slum. You know, it's basically an illegal construction which people who don't have a right to own properties in Chinese cities build illegally and kind of connected to electricity and other services at a better instance. But why do these places exist? Well, while China managed its urbanization extremely orderly, and even these slums are kind of orderly if you look at them, they really are. They're impressively well organized, and everything considered they are illegal. But Chinese basically China has and I can correct me here if I'm saying something which is slightly incorrect. China basically has two kinds of residency, which is and now I probably won't pronounce it correctly. It's called a Hoku system, where you basically have a city residency, or you have a agriculture farmland residency. People who have farmland residency are not allowed to live in the cities, but the regime, the government of China kind of ignores the problem because, well, the cities need a lot of migrant workers. And so they move to the cities, but they can't legally gain residence, so they build illegal houses instead. I know there was kind of a liberalization recently in this respect, and even Chinese government kind of understands it as a problem, mostly because the people who don't have a city residency and still live in a city, they basically don't have access to healthcare, they don't have access to schooling for their kids, or they basically have to find these informal schools for their kids. At the same time, China does a lot. There's never has ever been a country which would actually build more housing in such a scope of scope of time. So there's another slide. There's a slide which he basically describes the problem. These Chinese favelas. Favela is a word, Portuguese word for a slum. They are basically illegally built on collectively owned rural land. The rents are cheap. But at the same time, even though these things kind of exist, China actually managed to managed a more orderly system of urbanization than most of the developing nations. And that's because spending on housing and on infrastructure and on public transport, it has never been done in such a level, and that's why China actually had right now it's under 2 million, just under 2 million of migrant workers who have left the place where they were born and moved to the cities, which are mostly on the coastal, on the coast, but also there's a lot of cities which are inside of China. Wuhan, as we know, it's an inland city, a region of 1 million of people. Why do the slums even in China exist? Well, because there's still more people than the government or the economy is able to build houses for, who are moving to the cities. Because the urbanization was so large. That's why these slums kind of became a thing. If I go to another story, which is very similar to what's happening in China, with one important difference. The slums in most of the world elsewhere in China are actually much worse place to live. So this is a picture of Rio's favela. Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, and you probably know these pictures quite well. Similar pictures in a way. They are basically houses which are built almost one on top of each other. They obviously don't have organized paths, streets in between them. They don't have electricity connections are usually done because electricity connections are easy. But that doesn't apply to sewages and water mains. So for these cities, they usually have no water supplies, or these parts of cities have no water supplies, and water is usually carried by hand, or a truck comes and sells water at 5 times the normal price. And again, like, the urbanization in mostly like these favelas, they are all around South America, mostly because the urbanization is still happening there. South America is already heavily urbanized, but it's still kind of going on because, people just still have the the economic motivation to move from the farmlands when they have almost no income to cities and live in slums. And it might be surprising to you if you are living in a farmlands, somewhere in south of Brazil, and you move to slums in Rio de Janeiro, your income actually goes up and goes up substantially, and that's why people do it. That's why, like, we know these places become to be, because people want to become richer, and they do it by moving to not so nice parts of towns and cities, but still much better than what they were before. And that's not only visible income, that's visible also on other aspects. So here on this slide, slums are good or bad. Again, like, economists think that, like, urbanization is important and slums are better than actually no movement in workforce. So a few kind of random statistics. 90% of Rio residents earning more than $85 a month in 1996. The statistics are kind of old, but, like, it's you get. Only 30% of people in the rural northeast of the country were above that poverty line. And so 10% of people in Rio, only 10% of people, in Rio are actually under the poverty line as measured in Brazil, while 70% in rural areas are. Another important aspects of cities is that, like, well, if you live in a slum in Rio de Janeiro, well, you pay a lot for clean drinking water. The problem is that you can the advantage of that is that you can still get the clean drinking water. While if you live in somewhere in, like, in the farmlands, you usually don't have that. So. And that applies to your general as well as it applies to the statistics from Lagos in Nigeria, which basically, like, again, like a city which urbanized really fast, and, like, the population is still increasing really fast. So 3/4 of people in Lagos can get a safe drinking water, while anywhere else in Nigeria, it's only 30% chance that you actually have access to clean water. Why is it important? Well, drinking water actually is one of the safe drinking water, clean drinking water is actually one of the most important things in the developing countries, because access to it determines how long you're going to live. Most of the diseases are carried through water. So if you have access to clean drinking water, basically your life expectancy increases really dramatically. So people in these countries, who live in the cities, basically have much better chance to live a long period of time and to live a healthy life. While if you live in farmlands, it doesn't really apply that much. So of course, like, the belief and the hope here is that the areas which are slums nowadays will not be slums in the future, that eventually they're going to be rebuilt into normal looking cities, as it happened in many places in the world. The best examples, are from New York. So, like, for example, shanty towns, which is another word for slums, in Hell's Kitchen in New York. It used to be slums. Nowadays, it's one of the most, one of the most expensive neighborhoods. Well, almost anywhere in the world. If you don't know where Hell's Kitchen is, it's in Manhattan. The other example is also, Manhattan. Again, like, one of the most good. Yeah, it used to be all Irish slums at one point of time. So, what you should really see here is that even though urbanization brings a lot of this kind of disorganized urbanization, the trend is actually positive, because if you finish, basically means that you have an option. You have options. Your kids will have options. You have a access to have a bigger income and access to job market for even bigger income yet. While if you stay in a farm somewhere in a north Nigeria or middle of Brazil, you probably won't have that access. Your kids will have access to education if you can find it and can afford it, of course. But again, living in a city translates to a higher income, so education of your kids is going to be as well. So that because of that, urban slums often serve as springboards to middle class prosperity. It's a kind of like a normal thing to look at slums as a terrifying story of how people live, but you should really understand it as a choice of the people who didn't want to live in the farmlands, move to the slums because they were looking for a higher income, and they quite often got it, even though it doesn't seem to be so much. You still compare it to something which you don't see. They're like absolute poverty somewhere else in Brazil or Nigeria or anywhere else. And that's pretty much all I wanted to tell you today. So normally what I do in this point is a discussion, but of course that's kind of an easier thing to do when you are in a classroom than if you are on Microsoft Teams call. And I would just like to ask you if you have any questions to this topic. And also, I forgot to thank you all for the papers you sent me. I've seen them. I didn't manage to read them yet, and I'm planning to mark them, grade them over the weekend. So till then, please just bear with me. I'm going to put in an INSYS. I'll just start inserting grades there, so you can see it. So, any questions?
I have a question on this topic. I mean, might become quite obvious. It's with regard to the current situation. Yesterday, I saw the reports by IMF and Moody's that they expect the world GDP to decline to a more extent than it declined in the 30s after the Great Depression. And I heard some reports in The Economist and New York Times that it will be the hardest drawback for the globalization ever, because more countries they start protectionism policies again. And what is your opinion on this? You think this will be a big challenge for the globalization?
It's really dangerous. It's first of all, there's a parallels with 1918, the Spanish flu epidemics basically resulted in a huge wave of protectionism, and basically a lot of borders were established after the Spanish flu epidemic. So there's a dangerous parallel for that, the country just start closing. It's already kind of happening, and it's kind of terrifying to see. First of all, with the medical equipment, a lot of countries just started hoarding and prevented exports of ventilators, masks, of face masks, of everything. It is a terrifying thing to see. Czech importers right now have a huge problems to get stuff across the borders, and borders with if you I don't advise you to go anywhere but if you went to borders with Poland right now, for example, there's a lines and kilometers and kilometers long lines of trucks who are just waiting to be led across the border. So that is definitely a dangerous thing. With the GDP numbers, basically what we see now, the best equivalent, it really is a war. Basically what you have here is a supply shock where people can't produce stuff, and GDP goes down because of that. These supply shocks, they have one important thing to them, and that's they're usually quite severe, but the comeback from them is actually quite fast. Sometimes you can hear about the V-shaped recession, which basically means a quick fall and quick rebound afterwards, which is hope of basically everybody right now, that after the epidemic is over, which might take 18 months from now, but after the epidemic is over, that there's going to be people just basically go back to work, and continue as like it never happened. The problem with this is that companies are panicky and customers are panicky, and what happens now, what you can see now, is that basically people stop spending absolutely anything on investment goods. So nobody's buying cars now, nobody's buying property, housing, nobody buys that. Companies stopped buying any machinery. And so all of these companies will get in a huge problems fairly quickly. And that's why governments actually quite reasonably basically started supporting companies. The problem might be much less severe in Europe because our employment protection is actually quite strict. So firing people is costly. And also the European governments, including Czech Republic's government, established something which is called Kurzarbeit after German policy, which basically means that if you send your employees home, that the government is basically cover their wages, and in simple because the companies don't fire people, and after the epidemic is over, they basically just return back to work. What you see in the United States, on the other hand, is absolutely terrifying because they have no safety net. And it means that, right now, there's about 16 million of people who were fired in the last 3 weeks in the United States. Such a number nobody saw ever. 60 million of people, and you're still talking about a workforce which is just short of 200 million. So there's a good chance that in the United States you'll see unemployment close to 20%. You will probably not see that in Europe, but the United States basically is just kind of highlighting the weaknesses of the system which they have there. It doesn't mean they will not be rehired after the recession is over, which might be again fairly quick. Again, this is not anybody's fault, with the financial crisis in 2007, 2008, the biggest worry was that, we will give all this money to the bankers but they caused the problem. So why should they be saved, right? The moral hazard kind of argument. With what we have now is it's nobody's fault, right? So the government really should step in and help because you can't really expect all the companies to have savings on the side and wait for 100 years if a global pandemic comparable to Spanish flu will come or not. No, the government really should be an insurance here. At least that's my opinion. Yeah, so that's in regards to the GDP numbers. With the globalization, well, yeah, the historical parallels there are kind of a problematic. Well, because we never had a pandemic in the modern times, especially not such a deadly one as we have right now. The pandemics which happened in the history, it means the Black Death, the plague, or the Spanish flu. Basically, they disappeared after a majority of population got infected, and in about 3-4 years, everything worked as before. Including the way people behave between themselves. So I don't think that's I would be really surprised in 5 years that people would not be shaking hands, for example, as it's happening now. It's not going to be the case. This thing will go away. The only problem is the economic damage which will be done in the meantime, and how fast the rebound it's going to be afterwards. Yeah, so that's my take on it.
Thank you for the comprehensive answer.
Yeah, sorry, I just kept everybody for extra 10 minutes by this rant. All right, so thank you very much, everybody, for your attention. As I said, I'll grade your papers over the weekend, and in the meantime, I hope you'll have a good time, that you are with your families and or somewhere behaving responsibly and staying safe. And one thing about the global pandemic is that the most recent papers which were written on the topic show that the mortality is actually likely to be much lower than what was originally expected to last. It depends from country to country, which is kind of a strange thing. But for example, the mortality in Germany is now estimated 0.73%. So about 5 times lower than what the original Chinese numbers look like. And that's because mostly there's so many asymptomatic cases, which means people who just don't show any symptoms. And, you know, basically like these people will never get caught by tests, never, like they will never be identified. And so there's a good chance that, you know, like majority of, you know, like some countries will definitely now go through the stage that like basically majority of people will get the infection. But like nothing major is going to happen except of, you know, and like if it's a big except, a lot of people are going to die, you know, especially of until like in the older categories, but like also some younger people will die, even though it's kind of a you know, even though the probabilities there are really low. So like some countries like Sweden, for example, are trying to go through that like route of herd mortality, which means many people will get it, and like the sooner the country, like the sooner a lot of people in the country get infected, the sooner it will go away. It's a dangerous way how to approach it, but some countries are evidently trying, so we'll see what happens there. All right, stay safe. That's what I wish. All right, so thank you very much for your attention. As before, I'm going to upload this lecture to YouTube, and see you next week.
Thank you. Bye-bye.